Hi.
Hi, everyone. Good morning.
Good morning.
Welcome. We are so excited to be here with you today. I'm Kira Parrott, the Reviews Director at School Library Journal and Library Journal.
And I'm Shelly Diaz, the SLJ Reviews Manager and Editor of the SLJ Teen Newsletter.
And it is our great pleasure to be kicking off SLJ's 7th annual SLJ Teen Live, which is our virtual day-long conference about YA Lit and teen services. Before we get to our exciting keynote, just want to explain a little bit about how the day goes. The first half of our day is all focused on young adult literature. And then the second half of the day in the afternoon will be more focused on services and programming, very practical, innovative ideas and best practices that you can put into play at your libraries for your teens. And I think you want to talk about this year's theme.
And so this is the first time we've ever really had a theme for this event. And our theme this year is Speaking Truth to Power, because today's teens have shown in the past year and the, how powerful they are and what as agents of change. So today's YA and youth services librarians, they must rise to meet those needs of those teens. And we feel that this year's conference is full of author panels and authors and programming sessions that will give you the tools and ideas on how to engage with these teens and support them as they continue to make their mark on the world.
Yes, and before we get to Elizabeth Acevedo in just a moment, I want to just give you a few housekeeping notes and technical information. Your screen is completely customizable. You can resize any of the windows and you can move them around and adjust them as you like on your desktop space. If you accidentally close any of the windows, you can just bring them right back up by clicking the appropriate widget, which is down at the bottom of your screen. If you have questions for today's keynote or for any of the sessions throughout the day, you can submit those questions using the Q&A window at any time. And we're going to try to save some time at the end to take some questions from you, and we hope you have them. Let's see, a copy of today's slide deck, as well as a continuing education certificate, is available in the resources list. You'll need to print out that certificate and fill in your name. And if you forget to download the resources before the webcast ends, you can always visit the on-demand recording and access them there. Hey, are you on Twitter? You can follow the conversation straight from the Twitter window on your screen. You can tweet at us using @SLJournal and using the hashtag SLJTeenLive. That's hashtag SLJTeenLive. Also, for the best viewing experience, we recommend using a wired internet connection. Webinars are pretty bandwidth intensive, so closing unnecessary browser tabs and applications will help kind of conserve your bandwidth and keep the video not buffering kind of thing. But if you do experience technical difficulties, you can click on that little help widget down below. There's system requirements, frequently asked questions, links to test your system for visual and audio. And if that doesn't work, then send us a note via the Q&A box, and our tech team will get to you and help you out.
Okay, so now the part that you've all been waiting for and that we're super excited about. It's my pleasure and honor to introduce to you our opening keynote speaker. Elizabeth Acevedo was born and raised in New York City, NYC, and her poetry is infused with the Dominican bolero and her beloved city's tough grit. With over 15 years of performing experience, she's an internationally renowned slam poet, a longtime educator, and a rising star in the YA world with the publication of her debut YA novel in verse, the New York Times bestselling The Poet X, published by HarperCollins. And with us, we have Elizabeth Acevedo.
Hey. I am so excited to be here with you all. We're good? Yes. Okay, great. So I'm going to just start off with a couple of stories. And I get a lot of questions about the impetus of the Poet X. I get a lot of questions about you know, what is the message behind this character who's trying to find her voice? And so when I heard the theme was speaking truth to power, I knew exactly what I wanted to talk about. And it's going to be kind of twofold. So myself as a student and then myself as an educator, and how this theme came into play in the many classrooms that I've been in. And I want to start off with a story that I tell often, but that I was thinking of in a new light when I heard about this theme. I was getting my master's in creative writing at the University of Maryland. And at the time, it was a program that was rather small. There were only about 15 students in a cohort. I was the only student of Afro descent, right? I'm an Afro-Dominicana, a Black Dominican, someone who claims my descendancy proudly. And I was the darkest person in any room. And that was a problem for me, right? That I was the person who was looked to often when we were discussing certain topics, even if it wasn't necessarily a history that I knew much about, because I presented as the person in the room who was, right, the one who had to have the answer. I was the only person of Latinx descent who was writing about that experience. Both my parents are from the Dominican Republic. A lot of my poetry and my work has to do with that upbringing, with that culture. And so my poems would also be about that. And I was the only person from a major city. I was born and raised in New York, and I write a lot about New York. And so I would turn in these poems, and I call them Hood Morenita poems, right? Like these pieces that spoke to my upbringing and my neighborhood and my experiences. And I would always get them back, and the Spanish words would be circled, and the slang had question marks next to it. And I'm like, y'all know how to Google, right? Like, you don't have to be out here pretending you couldn't look any of this up. But it was that realization that my whole life, I have had to learn to look things up so as not to be the ignorant one in the room, right? Because there was already a stereotype of who I was in certain spaces. And I tried actively to fight against that stereotype by being more knowledgeable than my peers, even when it was a topic that was super, obscure. But when it came to simple things like a few words in Spanish or a phrase that folks weren't familiar with, it was easier for my classmates to say, I'm not sure if this poem is for me, than it was for them to do the work that I had to do when encountering their poetry, right? And it really hit me one day that perhaps what I was trying to do was a little different. When my professor came to class, and he was an old school dude, right? Long ass beard, Walt Whitman in the face, like one of those quintessential professors you think of. He had this melodious voice. And so anytime he talked, you wanted to lean in. And then he would say something real problematic, and you're like, wait, lean back. Like that kind of professor. And he comes to class and he says, I just read the most amazing poem about deer. And I have no beef with deer, right? I think venison is delicious. I'm not hating on anybody's wildlife, but being a very, very, staunch New Yorker, I haven't encountered a lot of deer in my life. And so this professor goes on and on for 2.5 hours about this deer poem, and then goes one step further. He says, I want everybody in the room to write an animal. And we know an ode is a praise poem. It's a poem that elevates something small into a higher level, right? Neruda's Ode to the Artichoke, Ode to the Socks, which were political poems wrapped in these very domestic images. And so when he asks this question, he goes about the room asking each of us students what we would write about. He goes to one classmate, and she says, like Elizabeth Bishop, she would write about the blackbird, which is like a very familiar poem. We know that. I'm like, that's not an original answer. He goes to another classmate, and that classmate says he would write, about sea anemones. And I'm trying to Google, like, what the heck is a sea anemone? And then my professor gets to me. And the one piece of writing advice you always get, and the one thing I've always fallen back on, is write what you know, right? You cannot get your own story wrong. And so I say I would write about rats, because growing up in any major city, you some rats, right? And so I'm proud about this answer. I felt like I was on Family Feud, like, good answer. And then my professor looks at me and says, rats are not noble enough creatures for a poem. Liz, I think you need more experiences. And that's a funny thing, right? I think you need more experiences. This was my first semester of grad school. How did this professor assume to know what experiences I may or may not have had, right? That how did having familiarity with deer surpass whatever other experiences I've had that have allowed me to move through this world, to get to where I am, to write the poems that I was writing. And yet none of that matters, is quickly disregarded because I can't speak on one topic that he and the rest of my classmates can speak on. And I think that there's a silencing that happens in certain spaces when we don't acknowledge the prior knowledge that people are bringing into a room, and that maybe it doesn't match what we consider academic intelligence or we consider academic aptitude in a topic, but that knowledge has to be honored, right? And I think about this when I go into classrooms. What are my students bringing into a space that I can then collaborate with in order to present something new to them, right? And I don't know that this educator at this time was really thinking about what he was saying. And I know he wasn't, right? Because the funny thing with an MFA is you have to turn all your work in. And so at the end of my 3 years, I turned in this portfolio of work and I snuck the rat poem into the very back, right? Which I did write. It wasn't a very subtle poem. It was called "To the Professor Who Told Me Rats Weren't Noble Enough Creatures for a Poem," right? So it's very blatant what I'm talking about. And I'm sitting in my thesis defense and this professor asks me, "So about this rat poem, it's quite clever. What inspired it?" Like, couldn't even fathom that he had made the comment that inspired this piece. That for him, it was just a passing, one of his rules. You just don't write about rats. There's certain things you just don't write about. But for me, it felt like an attack on who I am, where I come from, the markers in my life, right? And I was lucky enough to have been an 8th grade English language arts teacher. And I was in classrooms where I was the authority figure. And I was a very young teacher. I was 22 when I entered the classroom. And I think there was a part of me that felt like I had to overcompensate for my age by being really strict, a super authoritarian teacher, I demand the best of my students. But I wasn't always trying to get to know my students. There wasn't space for that in the curriculum. And I think that was at the detriment of my being able to connect with those young people, right? That I was the person in power all of a sudden. And I wasn't giving my students a chance to speak back, which is completely antithetical to who I am outside in the regular world. But all of a sudden, when I had this domain and this pressure of I need to help these students advance in this thing, I all of a sudden couldn't see them as humans, as people who were bringing in all kinds of information and stories. And I'm a little bit ashamed of who I was when I first started, because there was so much fear that I wouldn't be taken seriously that I think I alienated a lot of students. And the one way that I really figured out how to bridge a lot of those gaps was starting a poetry club at school. That this was all of a sudden an opportunity for me to see my students in a way that was different than what I assumed they had to be in class, right? And this gave me an opportunity to hear them, to listen to what they had on their hearts, to give them random prompts and then see what they came back with. And I was lucky enough that it was open to the whole school. So I had students who weren't my own. I had students coming from my honors classes and my co-taught classes, students with IEPs, students who were in advanced courses. And so there was a lot of ways that I could see them in a different setting, that they didn't feel the pressure of, am I a good student or a bad student? How am I doing in her class? Otherwise, this was a space that kind of democratized a lot of those ideas of what do we bring to the table. And all of a sudden, my students could now talk to me. Now they could say, wait, this is what we think is wrong in our neighborhoods, in our school, in our classrooms. And I didn't have to be on defense because I could listen. And so I really think about, when was I that professor and when was I my former student, right? When are we always trying to heal ourselves, and when also do we have to check ourselves? And I think when we're in spaces where young people are coming in and they have these stories that they think are separate from that space. And what I mean by that, the poet Sarah Kay has this theory, right? That students have this fundamental binary between what is for school and what is not for school. And a lot of times their artistic selves, their more vulnerable selves, the stories that they're ashamed about, that's not for school, right? School is for the work, school is for a performance, right? And I fundamentally believe that. We walk into certain spaces and all of a sudden we are performing that we are the authority figure. We're performing that we are this certain type of student, and we don't let the nuances of who we are come in. And I think that when we create these very explicit spaces that are for students to speak up and for adults to step back and listen, it bridges the gap between who they think they have to be in the world and who they think they have to be at home. And I wonder how we create a lot more of these spaces. How do we create this understanding between where we are out there and where we are back here? What do we do in the world? What do we do at home? And that young people, I think, need to be told, like, you are allowed to speak up here. And I know that to be true, right? I think about the poet X, and I'm often asked, is it semi-autobiographical, right? So the poet X is this novel with this young woman, Xiomara Batista, who does not know that she is a poet. She's been journaling her whole life, and they are written in poems, but she wouldn't call herself that. And then she discovers a poetry club at school that she doesn't think she can attend. And slowly she starts coming out of her shell by first reading her poems to, her love interest. And then she starts reading them to her friends. And then she starts going to this poetry club where there's a catalyst, because now she's seeing other people at that same age who are also writing, and she realizes she has permission. She has permission to speak. She has permission to ask questions. She has permission without any kind of critique to say, this is what I feel. And I'll say that I never acknowledge that the poet X is autobiographical, because I don't want my mama coming for me, right? But that there are moments for sure in the novel that match and map onto my own life. That I was a young person growing up in New York City, right by Columbia University, which means that on one end, it's a super affluent community. And on the other end, it was one of the most rat-infested, drug-infested neighborhoods in New York. And I didn't know where to go for answers as to why my life was so dramatically different than the kids down the block, right? The kids who were the sons and daughters of university professors, and my father, who was a blue-collar factory worker, and my mother, who was a childcare provider. What was that difference? And very young, I knew there was a difference, but I didn't know how to speak about it. And there were no books where I could figure out the answer. And writing for me was a way to begin wondering about, is this how it has to be, right? Do I have to feel like I am owed less or am going to be given less because of the block I live on? And I was lucky to have so many different kinds of educators come into my life and listen, right? That I didn't have a lot of folks putting, different poetry books in my hands. I didn't have a lot of critique on my poetry at first. I just had adults who sat in a room and let me speak, week after week. And that was probably the best way for me to start curating a voice, to start thinking about what is it that I care about without that being filtered through what is it that adults want me to care about? What is it adults want me to say? That I didn't have to impress anymore, because I could just be and speak with my classmates, with other young people, and not have that kind of pressure. And that's probably why I try to create those spaces wherever I go, where I step back and I'm not the loudest voice in the room. And that can be difficult to do when we feel like we're trying to guide young people. But what does that guiding hand look like? That when we approach youth as if they're coming from a place of deficit, as if they don't have most of the information they need, and maybe not information, but that they have a lot of the skills they need, right? That a lot of young people are facing circumstances I couldn't even imagine. And to think that I am the only one who can teach is doing a disservice to them and myself, right? Myself as a learner, and to them as to what they can bring into a room. And the moment that you empower a young person and you tell them, like, you have what it takes and you have it inside of you, I think that that levels the room, because it's not just you're pouring into someone. And that phrase I always have issues with, like we pour into young people as if they don't already come with a full life, right? That they don't already come with all of this information. And, you know, we always say children are the future. And I loved the way that we began this talk by acknowledging that the young people are the right now, right? That every major movement in the United States, like the catalyst, the people at the forefront, were young people. Like they often push our policies. They often are the ones who ensure that the demands are being heard, because they are unafraid in a lot of ways to speak truth to power once they are handed the mic, right? And that doesn't mean they won't take the mic, but that the moment you say, like, let me give the mic over to a young person, they're able to step up and say, all right, this is exactly what we want. They're able to articulate what it is they need. And so I hope that we continue thinking about how children are the right now, how young people are the right now, and how we can share space with them as opposed to always being the ones that are, you know, top down, if that makes sense. Just going to look at my notes real quick and make sure I touched on everything that I was trying to say today. I want to make sure that we have plenty of time for questions. So I think I'll close there, Shelley, if you want to jump in with some of yours.
Yes.
Yes.
All right. Thank you so much for that. There was just so many wonderful things that you said, especially the fact that that young people, they're not vessels for us to be pouring things into them, but they already come with such many, already full, right? And you spoke at Midwinter a little bit about how Angela Johnson, on one of the books that you read by her, kind of like put you or helped you understand the fact that you could communicate with an author, that like real life authors are real life people. And at one point, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, that she even like received a letter from you, and that kind of later on influenced the book that she worked on. So like, why don't you tell us a little bit about that? And maybe have you had a similar experience with your book?
Yeah. So Angela Johnson, when I was in middle school, I wrote her a letter about heaven. And there's a character in her book, Heaven, named Bobby, who is a teen father. And I had never read a teen father in a book. I'd never seen a character who was 16 with a child. And I had so many questions about this character that weren't answered in Heaven, because he was just a secondary character. And so I write her this letter. This was back when we were handwriting things. My handwriting was horrible. I don't even know how she read it. And I asked her more about this character. And I tell her that I think it would be a good idea to write this character's story. Little Liz was clearly always speaking up and always speaking out, right? And I didn't hear back from her, right? My teacher said he mailed the letter. I believed he mailed the letter, never heard back from her, but I was fine with that. I felt like I had expressed what I thought was good advice to this author who I really enjoyed. And then 2 years later, the first part last came out, which was Bobby's story. And it turns out that, you know, Miss Johnson had dedicated the book to me. And so the dedication read to Elizabeth Acevedo and the students at Manhattan School for Children, right, which was the middle school I went to. And that moment really mattered a lot to me, right? That it was the first moment I saw my name in print and realized that was something that I would like to see again, and realized that I had a good idea that someone was able to then flesh out. And just that moment of realization that an outside person who didn't know, had no investment in me, who wasn't just being nice or like, you know, just saying what I wanted to hear, thought I had a good idea. And being a writer now and knowing how many years go into a book, maybe Miss Johnson was working on that book long before she got my letter. But I think that the generosity of that moment of saying, I'm going to put this girl's name and her school's name into this book so that she knows, like, yeah, good job. Like, that was a great suggestion. Really made me think about, like, where are the little moments that you can always use space to empower other people. And so the Poet X is dedicated to a former student of mine, Catherine Bolaños, and to the middle school students that I taught at Buck Lodge Middle School in Adelphi, Maryland. And I'm lucky enough that our middle school invites me back every year, and I go back every year. And this was the first year I went back with a book and was able to read to them from the Poet X, and every student got a copy. And I think that moment of, wait, this book is dedicated to us and to our school. And this was a teacher at our school, right? That I think for them, it really collapsed what they thought as authors are over there, and we've never met an author. We don't know who they are or what they do or where they exist. So all of a sudden, this author is super close to our stories and knows us and knows our neighborhood. And I think it meant a lot for those young people. They all wrote me these really sweet letters. And so that's probably the closest I've gotten to what, Miss Angela Johnson did for me. And I hope that all the young writers that I've been able to work with throughout the years, keep writing, right? The one thing I tell every audience of young people is I hope that you see me up here and think, she's all right, but I could be better. That's what I hope young people think. I hope that is the impetus of yeah, that's a bar, but I think I could, because that's the inspiration. That's when you've pushed, a young person to really explore parts of themselves and to see that they can do it and that they could probably even move the bar, farther. I don't know, Shelley, was that?
No, that was perfect. Thank you for saying all that. It really does, I think, especially for young people of color, to see, a young woman of color's name in print and their own name in print. I mean, that really, when most of their lives, the names in print that they do see in books and, important media are not names like theirs. I think it makes such an impact. Kelly Loy Gilbert, who's a YA author that I admire, she recently shared a question on Twitter that someone asked of her at a reading at Panarsis bookstore in Nashville, I believe. And I love this question, and I feel like I'm going to ask this question anytime I get a chance to talk to an author. And so the question was, what is the question that all of your books are asking? And I wanted to pose that same question to you.
I mean, I have a chapbook of poems, Beasker and Other Origin Myths, that's thinking through, what are the mythologies we make of ourselves, particularly when we are erased from the popular narrative. What do we learn about our own existence, and how do we find mythology to map ourselves onto it? It's very much based on old school Dominican myths, right? In the Poet X, we have this character, this young woman who's thinking about how do you take up space, and how do you take up space with your voice, and how do you speak up and speak out. And my next book, which will be out in May 2019, With the Fire on High, is the story of Imani Santiago, who is a chef who is growing up in Philadelphia, who has these magical properties to her cooking where she can evoke memories in people, whether they want to think about that thing or not, and is also a teen mom. And so has to think about what are the responsibilities that she carries, that she needs to navigate in order to keep dreaming. And that perhaps what all these things have in common is, how do young women of color who are raised in very particular ways to think of themselves as a secondary character to their own lives, right, become the hero of their story? How do you make of yourself and find in yourself enough to say, I am allowed to be the one, right? And I mean the one in terms of the popular trope of the one, that you have the magic to be your hero. And I don't know if that's a question, right? But that I do think that it's my always considering, how do we take the stereotypes we have of a lot of different kinds of young women, particularly young women of color, particularly from the hood, and say, here are some of the dreams and aspirations and ways that we still walk through the world and subvert all of that ideology and pressure to come out on top. and that we can, right? And I don't believe in writing, you know, quote unquote poverty porn or you know, but I believe in telling these stories with so much integrity and just a reminder that like people survive and they thrive and they create beautiful lives out of situations that would render a lot of folks, you know, would flatten them. And yet we make such beautiful stories. And so I'm not sure if that's a question my work is asking, but I think it's a answer my work is trying to provide.
That's amazing, and I'm you know trying my best to not choke up right now, but thank you for that. And so you did just mention your second book, the one that you're working on right now, and I was just wondering what has been the major difference, negative or positive, about writing your first book compared to now writing your second book?
Yeah, so it's funny because The Poet X is the first book published, but it's not the first book I wrote. That I wrote a fantasy novel. It was like a 400-page epic fantasy, right? It was horrible, so bad. And then I wrote With the Fire on High, or the first draft of With the Fire on High. And I wrote it during National Novel Writing Month. Both those books were in prose, where the majority of my life I've been writing verse and poetry. And so With the Fire on High was written during a month. I hit the 50,000 word count, and I kind of put it to the side because it felt like it needed a lot of revision, and returned to Poet X and started working in verse again, and realized that I had mastered a lot of different plotting points that I didn't know how to do before. I had a better sense of characterization. So I consider those novels my practice novels that helped me get to where I was. And The Poet X came very quickly once I started writing it. It moved quickly, revisions moved quick. I think my editor and I had very clear ideas on where the story was and where it needed to go. And that process was easy, right? It felt like cake. Like I was like, this can't be what it's like. It's not what it's like. With the Fire on High taught me what it's like, which is a manuscript that I had revised, but was still one that needed a lot of work, that was asking really big questions that I kind of needed an outside eye to say, well, how do we bring it back, and how do we distill a lot of those questions and a lot of this narrative? It's in prose, and I have a lot of insecurities around sentences, right? That I have a lot of commas and dashes all over the place. And my editor's like, this is not a poem. Like, I need you to get this together, right? And so trying to really work through bringing up the parts of my writing that I think can be stronger, while also remembering the parts of my voice that really do carry a story, right? And so it's been this kind of negotiation with myself and with my insecurities. And I think every project brings up a lot of doubt. And so just remembering that, like, I probably felt this way during The Poet X. I'm just now on the other side. And so I don't think about it as much. And that when I'm on the other side of book 2, writing book 3, I'm going to return here again, because you're teaching yourself how to write every novel. And it doesn't matter how much writing you've done, you're always trying something new that's going to, you know, make you a little bit uncomfortable. And so it's been a process, but I'm enjoying it. I'm enjoying learning more about myself and also seeing just what I can do.
Excellent. So we have lots of questions from the audience. So what I'm going to do going forward is I'm going to try to moderate some questions from the audience, and then every now and then go back to some of the questions that I had prepared in advance. So the first question from an audience member we have is from Amy Cornwell from the Goodwin Library. And she's asking, what advice would you give teen authors who are looking to get published, since it can be obviously very hard to get in front of publishers?
Yeah, I think that one thing that I do for a lot of the young people that I worked with the DC Youth Poetry Slam team for a very long time, which is part of Split This Rock, a poetry organization here in DC. And I try to be very good about finding like different contests, finding different adult branches of contests and of publishing houses that would have like a teen something, right? Whether it was a teen competition or a citywide poetry contest, or whether, you know, the local newspaper or magazine had a column or something that had to do with poetry. There are also several magazines that are dedicated to to the writings of young people. And so trying to find a list of those and sending them to those young people. But I think that a lot of it is just how do you circulate within the community, right? That I'm a big proponent of looking inward first, especially when preparing young people with the confidence of moving outward. What is a local, like, does the school community have something? Does the library have something? Is there an online resource that people in your neighborhood or your town check in that, you know, having this poem up would really matter a lot, because getting the affirmation from your community and knowing that you can speak in that space, I think really empowers young people to then realize that they can go outward, if that's safe for them to do, right? Because sometimes if you're writing critically about your community, that might not be the space for you. That so many young people I've worked with actually don't want their parents coming to a poetry slam, or don't want the people in their school reading their work. And so then I had to do a little more work as to what is a national competition or something. And I say competition because so often with young people, that's where a lot of publications lie, right? They're trying to create, I don't know, that's the space. There's a lot of contests and competitions for young people and not as many publication resources. And then I would say I would try their hands at full journals, at, you know, journals who maybe aren't necessarily looking for young people, but if the voice is advanced enough, if the student is working on their craft and can handle the feedback and critique of rejection, have them start off from jump, you know, giving it a chance. That the worst that could happen is they learn how to write really good artist statements, and they learn how to, you know, think more critically about what a journal wants and needs. And I would also just always put the onus on the student. Okay, this is my last part to this question, right? Because students are so good at researching a lot of things that they're interested in. And then the moment that it's something even remotely academic, they like want you to give them the answer. But that I think have them tell you who their favorite poet is and where did that favorite poet publish. And then have them submit to that journal where their favorite poet published, and see if they are in conversation with their favorite poet and that journal. Have them find 3 different spaces where they can publish, where they see other young people publish, and then have them submit to that, right? That I think putting the onus on them really allows them to own that this is their process and journey.
Okay, awesome. That's great advice. So many different ideas that you brought up. So I hope librarians out there are listening. We have another question from a librarian, and this is from Tanya Dupree from the Detroit Public Library. And she's asking if you are available for Skype or other personal appearances at library conferences. And so I guess if you are available, how would someone interested in having you speak be able to arrange that?
Right. So I usually book my tour about, I call them semesters because I'm mostly doing schools in advance, right? And so fall is completely booked, but I'm booking for spring now. And the best way to reach me is through my website, Acevedo, Acevedo, Writes, WRITES.com. There's a contact form. And if you contact me, we'll figure out dates and all of that jazz. But the majority of outside of writing, I spend a lot of time on the road doing school visits. And so I'm definitely, and not just school visits, right? But different events for young people and for college students. And so I'm available and would love to come to Detroit.
Right. So I'm going to now switch back to a question that I prepared ahead of time. Let's see. Poetry, writing it, performing it, is obviously a big part of the Poet X. And what advice would you give to educators who want to get their teens more excited about poetry?
I think it's helpful I'm not someone who's a proponent of like only teach live poets. I think it's important to teach live poets though. And sometimes a lot of students can't connect with poetry, one, because they're taught to be afraid of it. And I don't know where that happens, right? Because if you work with kids from kindergarten to 5th grade, they are writing poetry, they are used to hearing a lot of their books being poetry, they are very familiar with poems, right? And have been for a long time. And then the moment they get to like 6 through 12, I think maybe because the questions we start asking are scaffolded differently, and now we're asking them to analyze and to tell us what a thing means, and they're not allowed to just enjoy a poem, there's this like gap that is created about what a poem is going to ask of them, right? And I think if we just distill it to what are the most literal things, right? My favorite question to ask any classroom is, what is the literal situation? What is actually happening in the poem? Because it can at least ground the room in what is at play. And then everyone feels like they're on level playing ground. At least we all know what the poem is about. But we may not know what it means yet, but we know what it's about. And that acknowledgement of there is no right answer, right? But there is proof in the text as to what is meant, right? We can't just make stuff up, but we can look critically at the text and close read enough to figure out enough details to put a picture together. And I think once you start just asking those small questions of like, you know, let's look at all the verbs. Do all of the verbs have a certain kind of tension to them? Are they all really sharp? Are they all really quick movements? Is it right? Then students can start looking for the little pieces that make up a much bigger meaning. That said, I do think that we have to pair the canon and the classics with living poets. I think the most exciting poetry that we've had in the last 50 years is probably being produced at this moment. That, you know, for so long, every year an article comes out, poetry is dead, poetry is dying. And in the last 5 years, poetry is coming back. More, you know, Americans are reading poetry now than they have in the last 100 years, right? So I think there is a lot of energy around the work that is being created. And it has to do with videos. It has to do with the virality of a lot of these pieces that then allow students to get to know other work. And so how do we continuously create doorways, right? How do we use, you know, Robert Frost and then put him in conversation with Patricia Smith? How do we continuously say, here is something that you are going through right now, and here is how someone was going through that 100 years ago. And the language may be different, but we can figure out the heart of this. So yeah, close reading and living poets. My answer.
Awesome. So this is a question from Naomi Pickens from the Spartanburg County Public Library. She asks or says, you mentioned in your speech how important it is to have a safe space where young people feel they don't have to perform or where they can be themselves. How can we create this space for them, whether it's in a library or a classroom? How did you create this space?
I think I had to break down a lot of like the culture of my classroom had to change when it was the poetry club, right? That I couldn't just be Miss Acevedo who was at the front of the room, right, with my PowerPoint, that I sat down with them, right? We sat down in a circle. That I think there are a lot of small cues that let students know, like, we are all here on the same page, and figuring out those small cues. A lot of times when adults are in a room and let's say it's a poetry club or creative writing club, they don't want to write, right? We're facilitating, but we're not the writers. And I think that moment when you say, I also wrote to the prompt and I'm not sure if it's very good and I'm still going to share it, it's like, oh, you are putting down your armor as well. And I'm speaking very specifically through a poetry club lens, right? But that I think that can happen in any capacity. If you're having a club about the environment, if you have an after school program, if it's a book club, how is it that you allow yourself to show vulnerability that reminds young people that is a strength, that it is okay, that it is being modeled, and that they can also bring that into a space, because that is where safety is created, is knowing that everyone in the room, and that doesn't mean you overshare, right? But that you are strategic about letting your own guard down so that young people know that they can let theirs down too, right? That you don't always have to be the figure at the front of the class. And those are just some like quick little tips. So that's a question that I'm going to think more about, because I think every space, depending on what is the focus, it can be done a little bit differently. I'm a big proponent of just feedback, right? So just at the end of every class, or at the end of every session, just a quick thought, like, how did today go? What did you feel? It can be anonymous. We always know young people's handwriting, but it's like, sure, make it anonymous. But just that them knowing that they can give feedback and that they're not going to get in trouble, they're not going to get yelled at, that they can just say, I didn't like this prompt, or I didn't think, this poem we read made sense. And that you can say, okay, got it, right? And so where are the lines of communication continuously being opened, and they are not reprimanded or ashamed for disagreeing or for disrupting in moments where that's what they feel they need to do. And I don't mean disrupting like in the middle of class, but just where they say, no, this wasn't what I wanted, or no, I didn't like this. And they are firm that they are allowed to say that.
Right. Okay. Let's see, what other questions? Okay, Amanda Jensen from Hot Springs Public Library is asking, what is your favorite book that you did not write? Something that just spoke to your soul?
Oh, wow. I think that my favorite recent book that I did not write, that I wish I had written, is Dread Nation by Justina Ireland. I think that is such a smart way to reconsider historical events in this country and to create tension and fear using zombies, but really the most fear is other human, right? Other humans are like this. And I thought that was just so brilliant. And I will say that I am a huge fan of the work by Lucille Clifton. She is my favorite poet. And there is such comfort in her poetry. There is such recognition in her work that when I encountered her work at 16, I felt like I had arrived to a place that understood me. And I read her work now, and it's a different place than when I was 16, but it's still, oh yeah, I am not alone in my womanhood and in how I am trying to understand my womanhood, and in ways that I'm still confused by it. And here is, Miss Clifton putting it in such spare, simple language that carries so much nuance. And so I would, her book, Good Woman, which is a collection of essays and also poetry, is home to me.
Excellent. I have not read that book. I definitely want to read it now. So my last question that I prepared in advance is, who are some of, and this is related to the question that we just had, who are some of the must-read authors librarians working with teens should know about, in your opinion?
I love the work of Gabby Rivera, whose her book is just so smart, and it's about, queerness, and it's about joy. I'm really into writers that are considering how do you write hope and optimism and bringing that into a space, right? Into a space where we don't think it exists. I think all stories need to have a little bit of hope as a reminder, right? That we're going to be all right. And I think young people need that reminder, like, we're going to be all right. Clearly, everyone knows, like, Jason Reynolds is amazing and should be brought into the classroom. Ibi Zoboi, right? That the way that she is writing the Haitian experience, the Haitian American experience, the immigrant experience, I was lucky enough to have been able to do the audiobook for Pride, which is her retelling of Pride and Prejudice, but it's set in Brooklyn, in Bushwick, with a fierce young poet. And so that I think, you know, Justina Ireland, who I just mentioned, but that there are a lot of writers coming through from a lot of different angles telling stories. Tomi Adeyemi, like a lot of folks like, you know, but there's a difference between handing these books over and then really having a lot of conversations. That these are writers who I think really sitting down and asking young people to give feedback on what they're reading, because the layers in these stories should be taught at like collegiate levels. Like there's work happening in all of these authors' writing that is just, I think, sometimes being missed when we read it too quickly as opposed to diving back in. And so those are some authors that I'm currently obsessed with and reading.
Yes, I am definitely obsessed with those authors too. Pride and Prejudice is one of my ultimate favorites, and I have lots of family in Bushwick. Grew up in East New York, so love Pride. Can't wait to hear the audiobook. One librarian is asking, her name is Heather Bagley Rowe from the Stevenson School. She loves NaNoWriMo, and she was wondering if you would recommend it as a program to students or in libraries.
I think that actually NaNoWriMo has a sub-program for young people, so it's not 50,000 words. It's less than that. I love the practice of every day for a month writing, right? And I do Poetry Month, I do National Novel Writing Month, or I have before. And something about just that discipline of we show up and we write, and especially if you do it in a school setting and everyone is writing a thing, I think would be amazing. It might need a little bit more structure, just because I could see after day 10, young people being like, my story's done, right? And so you might have to give them different prompts every day. Maybe they're writing flash fiction and they're writing a really quick short story every day, or every week they're working on a new story. But I think with the right structure, just the practice of doing it every day is going to go really far. Them then realizing that everyone else has created a thing in this class, right? Even if we're just taking 15 minutes out of the day to write really quickly, I can't see harm coming from it, right? That I think it's fun. I think it's kind of like a game. I think it could be made into something that a school could get behind, a library could get behind, and really figure out how to support one another. And some really amazing stories might come out of it. And so often the emphasis in schools these days, especially public schools, we're not teaching students how to write, and we're not emphasizing how important writing is. And so to be able to create that space for a little bit, even for just a month, I think would reveal so much about what your young people are going through. So yes is my answer. That I think some type of something for a month of writing would be so dope. And so you should do it. And then let me know how it goes.
Awesome. So could you repeat one more time? We have some folks asking how to best reach you for speaking engagements or Skype presentations.
Yes. My website has a contact form, and my website is my last name, Acevedo, writes, as in writing, WRITES.com. So my last name, Acevedo, writes, WRITES. And Acevedo is spelled ACEVEDO. And there's a contact form. It'll have your name, your address, and then your message. And that'll go to, info@Acevedo Writes, and you will hear back.
Awesome. So I think we have time for one more question from the audience member. And we did receive a bunch more that we didn't get to. So we're going to try to gather them and send them to Liz. And if she has a moment, she'll be able to answer as best as she can, the ones that she didn't get to. But this one we have from Abby Daddario from the Kent District Library. And she says, I just started reading your book as a potential option for a community reads event for local high school students. What would you say is the central theme of your book and how that would inspire a group of high school students towards a better world?
I would say that the central theme of the Poet X is, how do you learn to utilize your voice to advocate for yourself, to express yourself, and to change your circumstances, right? That X has a life at home that is difficult, that she walks through the streets and is continuously aware of how she is objectified, that she goes to school and feels completely invisible. And she realizes that inside of herself is the answer to how to change a lot of these things, or at least to change how she feels powerful in the moments that try to make her small. And I think, you write a book and you don't always know what the theme is, right? Like, you're just writing the story, the themes come later. And that theme came later as I try to really, sculpt it and make sure it was clear. But that seems to be the loudest message that a lot of people are echoing back that they get from this book, that they feel as if they are reminded that their voice matters, that their writing matters, that their ideas matter, and that all of those things can change their life, if not the world.
All right. So unfortunately, we have to wrap it up. But I agree with Abby. I think this book is an excellent community read option for high schools and for public libraries too, not just for teens, but adults as well. So thanks so much, Liz, for speaking with us today. And I'm just going to wrap things up. But let me just push over this slide with the little thank you thingy. Okay. So once again, thanks to our wonderful, amazing Elizabeth Acevedo. To you, the audience, for submitting such great questions and for listening, and to our sponsors for making this opening session such a wonderful start. Just so you know, we do have resources for the Poet X in the digital resources folder. You should be able to see it on the bottom with the little widget somewhere in the control panel. And so there's a discussion guide there for the Poet X. Feel free to check that out. This webcast will be available for on-demand viewing shortly. If you haven't done so already, head over to the exhibit hall to visit all the booths and check out what author chats and giveaways are happening. Your virtual environment activities can lead to your entry in our grand prize drawing for an Oculus Rift virtual reality headset. Thanks again for joining us today. Enjoy the rest of your sessions. Thanks again, Liz, for your wonderful talk. And bye, everyone.